Hey balancers, and welcome to another episode of the Balance Theory podcast. For those of you that are just joining us recently, a warm welcome. I'm your host, Erika. I live in Dubai. I work here as a corporate commercial lawyer. I also have an e-commerce business, and this podcast is something I love to do. It is how I spend a lot of my spare time, really planning content for this, engaging with the community, hanging out on socials. For me, this podcast really piques my curiosity on the self-development path. It allows me to get curious about different aspects of myself, become more self-aware, really foster that innate curiosity that I've got in this space. I get to learn from incredible people and share all of their knowledge with you guys. And I also get the opportunity to explore different things that I have been thinking about, been struggling with, that have been challenges for me. All things which I know firsthand resonate with a lot of you guys. So today's episode is nothing short of another incredible thing I've learned. It's probably one of those things that has been one of the most impactful learnings and insights I've gained, not only for myself and how I deal with certain situations, but also to deal with other people that might be doing this to me. So before we dive into the content of today's episode, I do want to let you guys know, for those of you that are not connected with us on socials, and maybe you're also not in our Telegram chat, both of which the links are in the show notes below, and you're free to join and connect with us in either place. But if you haven't been connected with us there, you may have missed this special announcement, or I guess gift I've made for you guys. I've put together a podcast listening marathon. Now, what this is an ebook. It's 5 weeks worth of episodes, and I have themed them into certain categories. Now, the point of this marathon is to increase our self-awareness. It's to get to know ourselves better. So if you're currently feeling a little bit lost, you want to really boost that connection with yourself, you want to get to know yourself better, and you just don't know where to start, this ebook is really a really great tool for you to navigate different aspects. So we've got week 1 is mindset. Then we go through like a bit of a clearing of the crap. Then we get to know who we are. And then we just take those mindset shifts to another level. Then we've got some bonus content in week 5. So that is a free PDF you can download. I've popped the link to that in the show notes. I've put links to those episodes on both Spotify and Apple. So no matter where you listen, you'll have access to both. And you can really take your time with it. It's not like we've all started on a day. This is a tool and a resource for you to use. You can take it away and go through it in your own pace. But if you wanted to do it, you could do a podcast a day for 5 weeks. So for those of you that have already downloaded it and starting to use it, I'm loving seeing your feedback coming through. I think it's a powerful way when you have a little bit of a skeleton or a structure to work through some of these things. Otherwise, it can feel like a bit of an open-aired quest sometimes. So I hope you guys find that useful, and I would love to hear your thoughts if you get around to downloading it as well. Just before we dive in, if you haven't had a chance to yet hit subscribe or like this video, it would really mean the world to me, and it helps us connect with more people like you on the lookout for content like this. So let's get stuck into today's topic, projection or projecting. Now, this is a concept I came across a few years ago when I was in therapy, and it's something I haven't been able to stop thinking about and learning about ever since I heard about it. You guys may have heard in the past or in passing, like other people talking about others projecting or when you might be projecting. And so today I want to go into what that actually is. And then I'm going to break it out into 2 kind of segues. We're going to go down the road of knowing when we ourselves are projecting and how to sort of navigate that, some tips around that. And then how to tell when other people are projecting onto you, and also how to manage that. Because I think the biggest thing to realize about projection is it is a subconscious or unconscious kind of response. It's actually a defense mechanism that our body does. Again, a good old body and mind just trying to keep us safe and protect us. But in fact, it's actually a little bit of a negative thing. Now, what I actually learned in my research, kind of just bolstering my understanding about this topic before I did a whole episode on it, was that you can project in both a positive and negative way. But today I want to focus on the negative ways we do it, because I think that is a lot more detrimental. And I think I'd probably be safe to say it's something we all do a little bit more than, say, the positive stuff. All right, so what is projection? It basically involves displacing your thoughts, your fears, your emotions onto somebody else. And as I said, it's done in a way where we're trying to protect ourselves. So say you've got a really uncomfortable feeling that comes up for you, some shame, some guilt, some fear, some anxiety, anger. You feel that come up, and it's the act where you kind of put that onto someone else, so you deflect it off yourself and you don't have to deal with it, right? It sounds like it's quite harsh, but as I said, this is subconscious and it can also be quite subtle. And the reason we do this is because sometimes these things that come up for us are really big, difficult emotions. And so it's almost easier for us to deflect that onto somebody else than to deal with it ourselves. You know, we're talking about deep-rooted core limiting beliefs or deep fears and anxieties we have. They're uncomfortable things. And so the mind kind of pushes it on, which is a little bit of an easier road than dealing with it ourselves. You know, no one likes being uncomfortable or in a state of distress. And so, as I said, it's like this subconscious thing we do to deal with it in the moment. Just to cement this a little more, I'm going to give you an example. So it's kind of like if somebody was a chronic liar, they're lying all the time, they may then start to believe that everyone around them is dishonest, right? They're projecting an insecurity or something that they're struggling with about themselves onto other people around them. They may have like a massive distrust for people around them, but that is a form of them projecting onto others, something that they can't deal with themselves internally. So basically why I want to spend a whole episode talking about this is because engaging in projection is sometimes difficult to detect, but I think once you're aware of it, you can start to really notice things. But I think what's dangerous about it is we can fall into this cycle of self-victimization where we keep blaming other people for something that we're failing to address within ourselves. Or as I said, it may come the other way where you find other people are projecting onto you, which can also be a really difficult and tough situation. But I think understanding what could possibly be going on, of course, like you don't know what everything is that everybody's dealing with, but understanding that this could be something, what it looks like, how to tell when it's coming up, I think is very, very useful because I think it is a common thing. And, you know, people sometimes don't even know that they're doing it. So let's start with ourselves. Obviously, that is the place where we have control, where we can actually make impactful change. We can't control other people, but we can bring that awareness to ourselves and start getting curious there. So I'm going to share 7 signs that you might notice for when you are engaging in projection or when you're projecting. The first one is excessive sensitivity. Now, I mean, there's a place for being sensitive, emotional, and we need to validate our feelings. However, when it is excessive, where you feel like you have a disproportionate response or reaction to something, that could be a sign of projection. So it could be that a certain situation has presented for you and it has triggered a heightened emotion because it's linked to a very deep limiting belief you have, or a fear, or a past situation where you felt guilt or anxiety or betrayed or any of those things. It could be that because it's touching on that thing, you're then heightened when triggered in a new situation. And that heightened sensitivity can be an example of projection. 2 is if you've ever found you're in a situation and you're quick to blame, that's a very good example of that quick deflection, right? It's also a self-victimization thing. It's saying, oh, you know, it's not me, it's because of that person. That's a probably an obvious sign. 3, this one's interesting because I can honestly say I've done this in the past and can pinpoint quite a few times where I've done this, is defensiveness to feedback. So getting really defensive and arcing up and feeling like you need to retaliate, protect yourself in that moment could be another sign that you're projecting. You know, not being able to digest some feedback that's touching on, you know, a quality you need to work on. And so instead of dealing with that, accepting it, taking on board that feedback, that defensiveness is a way to kind of outwardly project something that you can't handle yourself. Interesting. I definitely think I've experienced this one, and, you know, with a bit of reflection and hindsight, can say that was probably a situation where I was projecting an insecurity that I was too big for me to handle, or that I just didn't want to handle, or felt unsafe to handle in the moment. 4 is lack of objectivity. So you struggle to see things objectively from someone else's point of view, and you're very much in that one lane focus. Again, this is all very much tied to being a victim, feeling like you're a victim in a situation, and always just hinging on that approach, never really like moving on from it, never growing from it, and just staying in that victim mentality because it makes you feel comfortable or safe. 5 is recurring patterns. So I would say anything that we've mentioned so far that happens on a recurring basis. So you're constantly sensitive in a heightened way, or you're constantly being defensive, or you're repetitively being or you're repetitively being quick to blame. You know, any kind of patterns with any of the things we've mentioned could also be a sign that that's an ongoing thing. And I think that helps kind of pinpoint if it's like a one-off occasion. You know, I mean, we all feel off and have short tempers sometimes, and our tolerance windows weave and wane. But I think if it's repetitive, then it's a good sign that there's something there beneath the surface that's not happy, that you're then deflecting or deterring. 6, this one's interesting. Selective memory. So the idea here is that you're just choosing to remember certain facts or a certain version of a story that aligns with your projection, right? That makes sense for what you're trying to avoid. So you may block out things that confirm that limiting belief or that fear or that shame, and you only remember or tell yourself the parts that kind of affirm that you're not the victim. You know, you weren't the one that did wrong in that situation. It's anything that kind of removes you from addressing what could actually be the source of something you could work on. And number 7 is escapism. Now, I want to start by saying I think there's a place for escapism. I think it's good to switch off. I think it's good to have outlets, and it doesn't really matter what that is, whether it's Netflix binging or TikTok binge or just vegging out on the couch, you know, whatever your thing is. I think escapism has a place. But when escapism becomes a pattern for not having quiet time with yourself, for not addressing things that may be going on, for not giving yourself space to hear yourself, then I think it can be quite dangerous. And again, could be emblematic of that defense mechanism the body does, which is via projection, to just not deal with things that are happening beneath the surface. So those are some signs that you might recognize in yourself that might indicate that you are engaging in projection, or that you're projecting onto somebody else or something else. Now, I think inversely, when somebody else is projecting onto us, the signs are quite similar, but I'm going to go through them anyway because they read a little bit differently. So there's 10 signs that we could look for. The first one is similar to one we've already mentioned, and that is this idea of having an exaggerated reaction, a disproportionate response to a situation. Of course, people feel differently about different things, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. You know, someone might be more heightened by something than someone else. But I'm talking a situation that's like, it's completely exaggerated to the point where it's really, really disproportionate. Someone might get super angry at you for something that really does not warrant their response or their reaction, right? And I mean, I've actually been here in the last 2 years. This happened to me. It was super uncomfortable. It almost felt like it came from left field. It was completely blown out of proportion from what had actually happened. And so now with a bit of reflection, I can have a bit of empathy for that situation and think, okay, maybe that was actually a form of projection. Maybe that person was dealing with something that was an insecurity, something that was an anxiety for them, something that was a fear that I acted as a trigger for. And then this disproportionate response came out because it was too big for them to handle. So I feel like when you put the shoe on the other foot and you understand, okay, this is what it looks like when I do it, this is what it looks like when other people do it, it actually helps you navigate those situations that can be really jarring and difficult to deal with in the moment. Number 2, similar again, unwarranted blame. So if they're blaming you for something that really has nothing to do with you, or just doesn't really make sense, that could be a sign of projection. Again, you have to remember it's this person is deflecting something that's too big for them to handle. So sometimes it's nonsensical, or it doesn't really make sense where this comment or emotion or feeling aimed at you is coming from. That's kind of a really good sign that it could be them projecting. Negative language is a third sign, especially if it's kind of like towards you, making them feel like the victim and putting negativity onto you. That could be a sign. 4 is like, watch the intensity of their emotions and whether they're quite defensive. That can be a sign. 5, probably obvious, they have a lack of self-awareness. I mean, especially if it's like repeated behavior, or if it's like part of their personality. I feel like people are not born angry. People don't just walk around wanting to be angry. And so I think if this is like something they are dealing with and it's ongoing, it could be like also a lack of self-awareness. And 6, I kind of mentioned there, it's that repeating of the patterns. 7 is they may have like a distorted reality or like a distorted view of series of events where it's quite skewed. Again, it's kind of that similar one we discussed to when we're like have a selective memory with things. So when other people when it looks like they're doing that, it's like they're just remembering a version of life or events that suit that projection or that suit that defense mechanism that's offloading the emotion. That could be another one. Number 8, shifting responsibility and putting themselves as the victim could be a very strong sign. And you know what's crazy about this one is that in a situation they've created themselves, they can actually make themselves out to be the victim. I think this is an interesting one. I can recall a time where I remember a situation like this happening, and yeah, again, with hindsight and a bit of reflection, I can see I don't take it as personally as what I did at the time, because it so obviously was projecting, and it really had nothing to do with me. I was just either the trigger or the person that was there at the time. It needed to be deflected. 9, they may have boundary issues, so they might disregard either their own boundaries or the boundaries of others. And 10, again, the selective memory, so having a very skewed version of events, basically that's self-serving in a way. So I guess the signs that we see internally, the signs that we see externally, they are quite similar, because in fact we're talking about the same thing. But I thought it would be useful to split it out, because sometimes when we're doing it, it feels a certain way. And when someone's doing it to us, it feels a completely different way. So I hope that was a useful comparison, I guess, as to what it looks like when we're doing it ourselves and when we're on the receiving end of it. Now we're going to talk about how we actually deal with it. Like, how do we know what it is. We know the signs of when it's happening. How do we deal with it if we're on the receiving end? And how do we deal with it if we notice it in ourselves? And I think this is important. It's a very important exercise to engage in, because if we engage in continual projection, then it eventually could form a part of your identity. So I'll give you an example. If you have a father, a dad, who never built what he believes to be a successful career, and so he has this limiting belief about his own self-worth, he may eventually then raise a son or a daughter and inadvertently or subconsciously have comments like, you'll never amount to anything, there's no point even trying, success is not for you. Those backhanded comments that are a complete projection of his own limiting beliefs about his own version of success. He is just projecting that onto his son, and he may be viewed as a very negative person, but in fact he has internalized, and those projections have become so common that it's become a part of his identity, and he can no longer distinguish between what his mind and brain are trying to do to protect him from dealing with an uncomfortable feeling of maybe lack of self-worth or disappointment in himself, and that ends up translating into him putting that onto his future children. So I think it's really important that we become critical and aware, and just have a few tools to be able to deal with this in the moment, because I think it can be quite harmful, not only to ourselves, but then other people around us that we may be trying to support, but without even realize be projecting onto them. So there's kind of 2 steps here. The first one is really about reflection and self-awareness. So I think this is easiest to do if you have an example in mind, either of yourself projecting. So maybe when I was talking about getting defensive with feedback, that raised a situation where you can recall doing that. Or maybe if you've been quick to blame, or if you've been engaging in like victim mentality. If you've got anything like that that you can think of, then that's just keep that example in mind. Or you might think of a situation where somebody's been projecting, because I think these are great and you can put them down and note them down for later. But if you can actively workshop them as we go through, it gives you kind of like a live working example and something you can take away and do right now after we finish chatting. So let's just go with the example of getting feedback at work, right? Getting some constructive criticism and you getting really defensive, right? So you really have to think about that situation and start to ask yourself questions like this. This might look like a free-form journal for you. You might just want to ponder on it, but start to engage in this kind of Q&A with yourself. Does this person's words or behaviors remind me of anything from my past? Do they remind me of somebody from my past, a certain event from my past, a certain situation from my past? Maybe that could be a parent that was really tough on you growing up, and your boss speaking to you that way brings you back to a time where they were really tough on you growing up. A few other things you can think about. How does this impact me on an emotional level? What am I feeling? Where am I feeling it? What narratives or stories am I telling myself about this person or the current situation? Very powerful question, because that will be very quick to tell you if you're engaging in that victim mentality. In what ways do I find similarities between my behavior and this person's behavior? So maybe it's actually that you're really tough on yourself. And when they're sitting opposite you, being tough on you, you can't handle that because it shows how critical you are of yourself. And that's something that you're not proud of, or that's something you want to improve. And so that person is acting like a mirror. You sometimes hear, or you guys may have heard, the idea that people or the world around you is like a mirror to yourself. This is exactly why, because the reason you're triggered by certain things is because it reflects or brings to light something that you have an emotional reaction to, or something that you're sensitive to, and that may be something you want to work on. Is it that you fear that you share traits with that person, and so when you get defensive or arc up to them, or you project in any of the ways that we discussed, it's actually because they're reflecting something that you don't like about yourself. Sometimes when you meet people and you just don't like something about them, that is the perfect time for you to get curious. Okay, well, what is it that I don't like about them? And are there any similarities between myself and something I don't like about myself? Key sign of projection. Another beautiful question: what actions can I take to prioritize self-care in this moment? Because we can get quite destructive. We can engage in patterns, so continuing that behavior. So this is a really beautiful question. What do you actually need? What's your emotional response, and what do you need in that moment? And so by asking yourself, starting to think about some of these questions, yes, it might be after the fact. It might be in the moment. It might be a week later. Maybe this is something that happened years ago. It doesn't really matter. By engaging in this, you're starting that process of self-awareness. You're starting to unveil what's beneath the conscious mind, because this is a subconscious defense mechanism, and start to understand why it's happening. What is the source of it? Because it is protecting you against something. But what is that something? What is the uncomfortable thing that you can't deal with, or you can't handle, or you don't want to handle? And so you're not creating space for it. This gives you the opportunity to create some space for it. And of course, if whatever comes up for you is really difficult and it's challenging and it's something you feel is too big for you to handle on your own, please always seek professional support. You guys know I'm a big fan of psychologists, of therapists. I've worked with them myself, and to process things that are really difficult to kind of do on your own, or you don't feel safe doing it on your own, that is such a good way for you to be able to work through this. But if it is something you feel is a limiting belief that you can handle, you can work through on your own, engaging in this is so powerful, and it really starts to turn your mind to look out for this, right? So when things come up again, when you see it in other people, when you see it in yourself, these questions are going to be sitting in the back of your mind. These signs are going to be sitting in the back of your mind, and the level of awareness will change that automatic process. It no longer becomes subconscious because you've made a conscious effort to become aware of it. And by virtue, you can then make change. You can start to understand. You can start to interject in that automatic response and decide how you want to deal with it rather than automatically projecting. Step 2 is going to apply not only for yourself, but this is where you're on the receiving end of projection. So you can use this step 2 for both. Obviously, you can still definitely reflect, I guess, on situations where you've been the receiver. However, you don't understand what's going on in that person's mind. And so trying to fully paint the picture and explain why they've acted the way they have is not really necessary for your own self-growth, right? I think understanding the mechanics and how it works and why it happens is good for a level of empathy, and it's good to create a buffer so we don't put that on ourselves. But you don't have to become an investigator and become curious about what's going on in someone else's life. That is their problem, right? What we can do, step 2, is all about setting boundaries. So let's start with ourselves. If we have realized that we are projecting, and we can kind of pinpoint what's going on, what feeling it's coming from, a past situation, what the trigger is, etc., you may need to put in place a boundary while you're dealing with it, or it might actually uncover something you need a boundary in long term. But you can start to think about what boundaries are necessary to give you the safety to process whatever's going on, because sometimes when we're surrounded by triggers, it's difficult to process or understand what's going on. My therapist explained it to me once. It's like, if you're trying to calm yourself down, but the lion is still standing in front of you, it's not going to work. So sometimes you need to put in some boundaries to create a bit of a safe zone so you have the space to actually work out what's going on. And when it comes to other people, it's not nice being on the receiving end of projection, especially when it's on the extreme side. It's like that direct blame for something you really had nothing to do with, or it's that direct negativity, right? And so boundaries for me look like, with those people, limited exposure, limited time, limited energy. I know it's difficult if it's people in like a common friendship circle, but there's no reason you can't say hello and then go and sit somewhere else. That's how I kind of always deal with difficult situations with certain people in certain friendship groups. I will never be rude to people, but I won't give them my time, right? Like I'll always say hello, but then I don't need to sit there with you and have some surface level chat about how your job's going and, how are you, the standard chit chat. We can just say hi and then keep to our own sides of the room. So thinking about practical ways you can set those boundaries that feel comfortable for you is going to be really important if you have people in your life that you already can tell are projecting onto you, or if you've been on the receiving end of projection, or if it comes up in the future, right? It might happen and then you might realize what's going on, and then moving forward, you have the tools to implement those boundaries because you understand the source of what is happening. And a level of empathy in these scenarios, as I said before, is super important, because otherwise the other default state is you take it personally and you can go down a spiral yourself. So I think it's worth thinking about, in the situation I had to take a step back and say, okay, where is the truth in this situation? Are there elements to this situation where I'm in the wrong, where I've crossed a boundary, where I've done something to justify this explosive response, this disproportionate response, and there were some things that I could reflect on. I'm like, okay, you know what? I can think about 1, 2, 3, but irrespective, the response was still completely disproportionate, and I don't need to accept that. I don't need to be on the receiving end of that. And so taking accountability where accountability is due. Don't use projection as an excuse for everyone else and then never engage in self-awareness, because that's no better than projecting, right? You're still being the victim. So I always say, look for this truth, look for the sense of truth in the situation and where you may be at fault. And if you can't find anything, or if you find some things, but it's still disproportionate, you have a level of empathy to detach and say, you know what? Not my monkeys, not my circus. This is no longer a me problem. I've taken what I can from the situation. I've learned what I can, but there comes a point where you don't need to be a receiver of that negativity, of that abuse, of that emotional chaos. That's not yours. So I think understanding this has been really powerful for myself personally. I can definitely acknowledge moments in the past where I've become really emotional really quickly. It feels like there's a volcano exploding inside of me, and then I can just realize what's going on after the fact, like I can reflect on it straight away and go, okay, wow, that was disproportionate. What the hell's going on? Like, what am I not dealing with? And it takes time. Sometimes you need to let emotions do their thing, but knowledge is power. So now you guys have the tools, you have the understanding of what projection is. If anything comes up for you in the process of implementing anything we've spoken about today that is a little bit too difficult, please seek help. Please work with a qualified person that can hold that space for you. That is always a really powerful way to work through these things. And I hope this has been useful to your own self-awareness journey, understanding a little bit more about your interactions, not only with others, but from yourself. So that's it from me, guys. If anyone's come to mind that you think would really enjoy this episode, I would be very grateful if you would share this with them now. It's such a beautiful, organic way for us to grow our community. And I personally always love when my friends send me podcast episodes, because it's like they thought of me. They knew exactly what I wanted to hear or something I wanted to learn about that I'd be interested in. So don't discount how nice it feels when you get a personal recommendation for a podcast. So share it along. Again, if you want to join the podcast marathon, you can do it in your own time. The 5-week ebook is in the show notes below. If you're listening on Spotify or YouTube, don't forget to like and comment. On Spotify, you can vote at the end of the episode, or just drop me your comments if you have any requests for future episodes. Same thing on YouTube. Sorry, Apple Podcasts, guys. I haven't forgotten about you, but unfortunately there's no feature for that there, but you can always reach me on Instagram. That's it from me, guys. I'll see you all next week for another interview, and until then, stay balanced.